Garrabrants is I really enjoyed getting to understand him as a person, an executive, and for me as a character. If you remember just a few years ago, after January 6th, Donald Trump was essentially practically a pariah in financial capitalism.
Persona non grata.
The big banks were not willing to lend with him. And don't forget, the big banks had basically been through this once before with him. When his companies went bankrupt in the early 90s, a lot of banks basically locked arms and said, we're not going to come back to you. And in fact, Deutsche Bank, Donald Trump sued Deutsche Bank, or maybe possibly vice versa, and they still ended up working together. But that really changed after the Capitol riots, and he was left in a financial landscape where he was going to need more money, or at least rather, loans were coming due, and he was going to need to find new ways of borrowing if he wanted to refinance. And he didn't seem there were a lot of banks unwilling to do that. Enter Greg Garrabrants, who, I don't know if you two had heard of him or had heard of Axos. It's a relatively small bank. Even people who are savvy about finance wouldn't necessarily know that name.
He's looking at Bailey for the record.
I'm looking. I only know
because of Hindenburg.
That's right. I was looking Bailey dead in the eye. But Axos was a really interesting candidate to lend to Trump for a couple of reasons. One is they've been savvy lenders in commercial real estate, which is Trump's business, don't forget. And another reason is that they have had this pattern of being willing to lend to people who, maybe their circumstances are a little hairy. Maybe there's something interesting. The way they would say it is that, look, they turned down customers that other banks would say yes to, Greg Garrabrants said to me, but they absolutely have a pattern of, I'm thinking of Alex Jones's media company, for example, being willing to lend to people and entities that other people might not. And those two things led to Axos not only doing that Trump Tower deal, but also Doral, which is a really important part of the Trump empire. And if you want to get really into the nitty gritty, they were also involved essentially indirectly in a Trump DC deal. And then the last thing I'll tell you is a guy who has long been a top shareholder of Axos, guy by the name of Don Henke. His company is the one that provided the bond for Trump when he had that massive civil judgment, just a couple months ago.
Well, and this is a company, Max, that has done tremendously in terms of profits, right? Ever since he took over. So can you walk us through kind of what it went from? I think your story had like $3 million in profit to what the empire, at least even though it's being questioned by the likes of Nate Anderson's Hindenburg, how that came to be.
Look, I mean, just as I think it's worth, as a financial journalist, taking really seriously reports like Hindenburg's, I think it's also really important to look at the hard numbers and to give people their flowers when their stock price and their profits and their assets go from nada to something very substantial. And Axos profits have been substantial. Now, I happen to write in my professional career, I tend to write about Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, Citigroup. Axos is not JP Morgan. Axos is not making money like Morgan Stanley. And Greg Garrabrants built a bank that was really, really tiny and extremely obscure into a relatively important bank. I think they're in the top 100. I feel like they might even be closer to the top 50 now, and that's an accomplishment. And he did it by, being a serious real estate lender, and I should point out, doing lots of other kind of businesses too, including mortgages. At a time, it was a great time to be a lender the last decade. The problem, though, is twofold. On the one hand, I think just about everybody expects there to be a serious reckoning with commercial real estate in this country. And then the second thing is he just has a huge amount of skepticism from Hindenburg and others that the numbers can't be trusted, that these metrics are too good to be true. And, so far, Garrabrants can point to a stock price and just say, I'm right and you're wrong.
Well, let's just want to call out from the Hindenburg report, the stock's up 26%. It trades under the ticker AX. It's $3.8 billion. So even though Hindenburg set its sights on it and it's pulled back from a recent high, it's still up pretty tremendously.
Listen, I mean, you do have to acknowledge success. And I hope that folks read my story because in a way it is kind of a story about winning and like the desire to win. In fact, actually, Greg Garrabrants gave us a quote about that. He said something along the lines of, he likes to win and he likes to win his way. And Hindenburg, I'm sure if Nate, the head of Hindenburg, were here, he would say, let's wait and see. Let's wait and see what happens. In fact, I talked to an analyst who right now is a neutral rating, and he said, look, when the environment gets worse, which I think most people expect it to, then there are going to be some losses. But even then, this neutral analyst doesn't expect huge losses at Axos, and that's all I can say is I'll be following along. I look forward to seeing what happens.